Welcome to instructions for Lab 5. You'll notice that Lab 5 is not in your lab manual, so these instructions are vital for you to be able to do that lab. There are two things that you should have printed, and I'm going to show these to you. You need these 2 pages. One of them says San Francisco on the top and has some data filled into this table here. The other one says Los Angeles on the top. It does not have as much data filled into the top. Otherwise, they look pretty similar. You also need some sort of ruler and a pencil. And you also need a calculator. Now, this is going to be a statistics type of lab. It's going to involve math. And some of you might freak out. Don't worry, I'm not going to test you on what we're doing here, but it's sort of interesting. Some of you might find it quite fascinating to figure out how we calculate earthquake magnitudes of large value that have never happened. How do we know the likelihood of a magnitude 8.5 on the San Andreas Fault if it hasn't happened historically? How do scientists figure that out? And so that's what we're going to do. I'm going to walk you through how we calculate that for San Francisco, and then your lab is going to be doing it exactly in the same manner, but for Los Angeles. This explanation might take more than 15 minutes, and these videos that I do can only last 15 minutes, so I might have to break this instructional video into 2 parts. We'll see what happens. So we're looking at the San Andreas Fault region in California, and that is the transform boundary part of the North American Pacific Plate boundary. This is a very complex plate boundary, which we'll talk about more over the next few weeks. But in this region where we live in California, it is a transform boundary. Now here is a probability map put together by scientists over a 30-year window of time, and this began in 2007, so it's already been more than 10 years since this probability map was created. And it's giving the statewide probability of earthquakes of a various type of magnitude, and then the percentage probability. And so the colors indicate the probability. And so here's Los Angeles, here's San Francisco, and the main structure of the San Andreas Fault is this orange line, and it's very red down by us. So it's a pretty high probability of rupturing. Now it's the next 20 years. You'll see that in California, there are lots of areas that have a high likelihood of magnitude 6.7 or higher. Here's a picture of part of California. This is in yellow, the main trace of the San Andreas. Again, here's San Francisco and Los Angeles. And everything in orange is the epicenter, or the place where an earthquake initiated for earthquakes of magnitude 5 or greater between 1973 and 2012. And the large yellow arrows are showing the directions of the 2 plates, the North American and Pacific plates. You'll notice that these orange dots, these epicenters, are not only on the San Andreas Fault. They're actually spread in lots and lots of different places. So this plate boundary is what we call diffuse. There's deformation or breaking of the lithosphere over a much broader area than just the San Andreas Fault zone. And if you can see all these tinier yellow lines that are also out here, those are lots and lots of smaller faults. The color also indicates how deep these earthquakes are, and they're all orange, indicating these are all very close to the surface. If we look at some of the major ones that are shown here, their magnitudes are primarily less than 7. Now there was a 7.8 estimated for the very famous 1906 earthquake in San Francisco. That was an estimate because we didn't even have a Richter scale back then. And then there's a 7.3 in Kern County in 1952. And then there was the Hector Mine earthquake in 1999, which was a 7.1. And neither of those were near LA or San Francisco. And you can see that there's a variety of damage, variety of casualties. And the bottom line is that an earthquake of magnitude 7 or greater really hasn't occurred in San Francisco or Los Angeles over the past 100 years. But we know that they have occurred, and we know that there's been devastating consequences. So getting back to this map, how do scientists calculate the probability of these larger events, like a 7.5 or an 8, if they haven't happened in the recent past? So the activity today is going to be to use data to extrapolate we're going to use data from smaller earthquakes to extrapolate to larger earthquakes, because there is a pattern that has been observed worldwide in terms of the number of earthquakes and the frequency with which they occur. So as I said, we're going to do San Francisco together, and then you're going to do Los Angeles on your own. What we're going to do is we're going to use 30 years of earthquake data recorded between 1983 and 2012, and we're going to take the data from the San Francisco area for the first part of this exercise, and then the Los Angeles area will be from here. This is not really important. This is just telling you that these are real data. This is not a made-up activity. And we're going to be looking for San Francisco at ranges between 2 and 9.9. Of course, there aren't any 9.9s over this time period. And this is the latitude and longitude range. And the data source comes from the U.S. Geological Survey. Then we're going to take these and we're going to do some statistical manipulation and determine how the scientists figured out the probability of earthquakes at the higher magnitude levels. Okay, so this is the one thing that we have going for us. Scientists have seen this pattern that the higher in magnitude earthquakes occur, the fewer there are worldwide. And it's almost like there's a factor of 10. So for example, a magnitude 8 or higher, there's usually one on average globally. There's about 15 globally of 7 to 7.9, about 10 times more than that of 6 to 6.9, 10 times more of that of 5 to 5.9, 10 times more, 10 times more, 10 times more as we go down. And so this is really convenient because we have a relationship that we can expect. So if we know about these smaller ones, we can extrapolate to the probability of the bigger ones. Now we're going to look at something called the mean recurrence interval, and I'll get to that in a moment. But that's basically the average amount of time from one earthquake to the next in these given regions. Before we go further, I want to talk a little bit about logarithmic number lines. So on the left, I have a linear scale, and I'm sure you're all familiar with linear scales. When you go up in a linear scale, you're adding by 1. And when you go down, you're subtracting by 1. That's a linear scale. But sometimes we want to plot data that have a huge range, much bigger than could be shown on a linear scale. The logarithmic scale, on the other hand, increases by factors of 10 with each increment and decreases by factors of 10. So when you go up one level on a logarithmic scale, you multiply by 10. And when you go down by one level, you divide by 10. And that's my divide sign on blue. So we don't have a 0 point on a logarithmic scale, we have 1. And as we go up, we multiply by 10 each time. As we go down, we divide by 10 each time. And that way we can plot a huge range of numbers, say from 1,000 to 0.001. Going back to our distribution of the number of earthquakes of various magnitudes, here those magnitudes are plotted on the bottom against a logarithmic scale of occurrence. So again, 1 magnitude 8 per year, maybe about 10 or 15 magnitude 7s, somewhere around 100 or so magnitude 6s, and we can fit all of these data points on one graph. If we tried to do a linear graph between 1 and 100,000, it would be very difficult to see the data points that are all down here. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to start with the San Francisco sheet. So you should get that sheet and you should work on the columns with me as I show you what we're going to be doing on the video here. And I can see that we're definitely going to need more than one video. All right, so you've got the first column shows the magnitude range, and the second column comes from the database. It shows you in this 30-year time period the number of 2 to 2.9s in this latitude longitude region for San Francisco, and it happened to be 1,716. And then it has the number of 3 to 3.9s, 4 to 4.9s, etc. And remember, in this time period, there were no magnitude 7, 8s, or 9s. Nothing was that big. Okay, so that's already been filled in for you on this sheet. So the question now is, what is the likelihood that such an earthquake will occur in this area in the future of these sizes? The probability analysis is going to give us an estimate of this likelihood. So now we're going to go to column C. And the first part of column C has been done for you. Column C is going to be the average number of earthquakes that occurred in each magnitude range per year. So since we looked over 30 years, we're just going to take the number in column B and we're going to divide by 30. So 1716 divided by 30 is 57.2. So on average, 57.2 earthquakes of magnitude 2 to 2.9 occur in this area every year. So now go ahead and pause the video and do that for the next several that have a number associated with them. And you found these values. Now, of course, 0 divided by 30 is 0. So the average number of earthquakes per year of a 7 to 7.9 is 0. Not surprising. So column D is going to bring us to this mean recurrence interval, or average time between earthquakes. And one way to get this is to take the reciprocal of the number of earthquakes per year. So here we had 57.2 earthquakes per year. We're going to take 1 divided by that number, and our mean recurrence interval is 0.017 years. So on average, an earthquake of this size occurs in this area every 0.017 years, which is kind of a weird number. If you wanted to turn it into days, you could multiply it by the fact that there's 365 days in a year, and it becomes 6.25 days. So every 6.25 days, a magnitude 2 to 2.9 occurs in the San Francisco area. Go ahead and try this for the rest of the column. Here are the answers. These are pretty straightforward. You just took 1 over the number that was over here. But what about the next set of numbers? That will be our next video.